Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is Brian Sigritz, Director of State Fiscal Studies for the National Association of State Budget Officers. He tracks and analyzes tax and revenue trends, as well as transportation, public-private partnerships, energy, and disaster response. He also monitors the fiscal health of states. And just this week, NASBO released a new report on state budgets, and we put a link to that in the chat. Prior to coming to NASBO, Brian worked as a legislative aide in the Ohio legislature and for the mayor of Dayton, Ohio. He has a master's of public administration from George Washington University. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event is being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Brian Sigritz, welcome to The Prescription.
Great. Thanks for having me today.
Good to see you, and it's a very timely topic. So let's start by talking about the current state of state budgets. It seems that overall states weathered the pandemic remarkably well. Some of this, I guess, was due to revenues holding up far better than forecast, and some was thanks to the very generous federal aid. From your vantage point, how are states doing right now?
Yeah, there's no question that state fiscal conditions have improved recently, especially over the past year or so. Immediately after the pandemic began, we saw states sharply reduce revenue forecasts. States reduced revenue forecasts by upwards of 20%. So that's what had been in that spring 2020 time period. And then after that, what we saw was revenues came in above those lower projections. States did not see the type of revenue declines that they were anticipating. There's a number of reasons for that, hitting on some revenue sources. With personal income taxes, we really didn't see the declines in those for several reasons. One being that high income earners really weren't impacted by this downturn. In previous downturns, we've seen high income earners at least somewhat impacted, and this time, for the most part, they weren't. States with more progressive income tax structures, we're still seeing strong revenue growth from high income earners. Things like capital gains continue to increase. And also with personal income tax, it was aided by some of the federal stimulus funds that we're going through. So, some of the things like the enhanced unemployment, the different stimulus checks, that also helped to bolster personal income tax. And also sales taxes, which is the second biggest source of state revenue, those turned out not really be impacted much either by the downturn. Once again, there's a couple of reasons for that. With sales taxes were helped with online sales taxes. Supreme Court decision several years back now, South Dakota versus Wayfair, allowed for greater taxation of online sales. States were able to capture that revenue as people started shifting their behavior and purchasing goods and products online. The other thing we saw with sales taxes is that one area of the economy, I should say the one area, but one part of the economy where we did see people kind of cut back was in services. And by and large, states don't tax services in the first place. So when consumers cut back on that, it really didn't impact state revenues, and current states or consumers continue to purchase physical goods and products. So that led the sales tax revenue putting up well. So all that being said and done, we saw state revenues hold up better than we were anticipating. We also saw the impact of the COVID-19 relief aid that helped states with both the direct impact of providing additional funds to states and also the indirect impact of helping to stimulate the economy, which then in turn helped to bolster state revenues. So fiscal 2021, we did see actual revenue declines in fiscal 2020, I should say. Then in 2021, very strong growth. 2022, we were expecting slower growth in state revenue, but so far, nearly all states we're seeing revenues coming above projections for the fiscal year. And it also appears that April tax collections were very strong for state ones that we're seeing report April. So far, revenues continue coming above projection this year as well.
Great. I want to unpack some of that in a few minutes, but I have to ask, some people say that the federal aid was actually too generous and in fact was the cause of some of the high inflation the nation now faces. Do you agree? Is there any truth to that, do you think?
I would say that, arguments can be made on what was the appropriate level of aid. I think it's clear, though, that the aid was very beneficial to both states and the economy because states were able to better weather the downturn. Even though certain segments of the economy weren't impacted, we did see impacts that lower income individuals, impact small businesses. So that aid was beneficial in states helping support the businesses and people that were impacted by the downturn. There was also flexibility in the aid that allowed states to direct it to the areas that's most beneficial to them. So what we've seen with this stimulus aid is it's allowed states to both respond to the pandemic and also to help the economy move forward. That's what we're seeing a lot of right now. The ARPA funds is that trying to look at both how to continue to help people being impacted by the downturn and also how to help me move forward. So, we're starting to be more forward-looking and not only responding to the pandemic, which is what things like the CARES Act, which is the first major piece of aid provided states. CARES Act was much more directed at responding to the immediate needs of the pandemic. Well, now it's more dual purpose for the funds.
So let's look just for a second at the immediate future. So as you said in your report, rainy day funds are quite healthy. Many states are cutting taxes, they're boosting spending. We can break down the details in a couple of minutes, but overall, what does the immediate future look like for the states? Do you worry at all that a slowing economy could result in shrinking revenues and new budgetary pressures?
I say in the immediate outlook, states are well positioned. So states have done a good job, as you noted, of building up their rainy day funds reserves over the past couple of years. But we've also seen states take action recently to deal with some of the long-term challenges. We've seen states make additional pension payments, trying to lower the unfunded liabilities for pensions. We've seen paying down debt recently. States have worked to shore up their unemployment trust funds, which really turned to those during the downturn. States have taken the steps to try to prepare for the next downturn whenever it comes. I think this in fiscal 2023, there's a possibility that revenue growth won't be as strong as what we saw in 2021, especially we're not expecting it as strong and probably not as strong as what we're seeing in the current year. So we are expecting to see some revenues slow down in fiscal 2023. Also, state spending side is likely to not be quite as high as what we've seen in a couple of recent years. That was really bolstered by some of the one-time. States have looked to use one-time funds, one-time purposes, and are trying to position themselves as well as possible for us coming.
So one of the issues, of course, we've been talking about the potential risk of a slowdown, but another issue is inflation. And how is inflation affecting government spending now?
Yeah, so inflation, so the immediate impact on revenues was, for the most part, a positive for states. On the sales tax side, especially when the price of product go up, states get more sales tax revenue. On the personal income tax side, it's probably not as direct of an impact, but the salaries go up. That can all higher revenue for the states have solved. Part of the reason for increased revenue is related to inflation. On the spending side, the expenditure needs do increase for states as it goes up. So that will be something states will be looking at in the future. To see how much of an impact inflation. There's several areas that states are close watching, looking forward with, when trying to determine the revenue forecast, inflation being a big one. Other areas, geopolitical events right now, and Ukraine can impact revenue moving forward. Things like workforce shortages, are closely watching. Actions of the Fed, it's just seeing how the overall national economy plays out since state revenue is so close. And then, of course, the future of COVID-19. We don't talk much about COVID-19 as we had in the past few years, but possibility of future variants or future changes that could impact state revenues moving forward.
So you're raising an interesting question. Sort of anticipated one of my questions. It's got to be really hard to be a budget officer right now, to do budget forecasting. You've listed, COVID, inflation, labor shortages, Chinese lockdowns, Ukraine, the Fed's raising interest rates. How difficult is it for state budget officers to forecast now, and how do they adjust to all of these extraordinary changes?
Yeah, no, it has been difficult. I think what the past 2 years have shown is, the difficulty in predicting both the path of the pandemic and the economy, and that continues as we're moving forward with the path. It's been difficult. That's part of the reason why states have been taking some of the actions, as you briefly mentioned before, to try to prepare themselves for a future volatility. It has been very volatile. We've seen tremendous swings in revenue, immediate downward swings, but then recently upward swings in revenue. So that's part of, with the revenue growth, what we're seeing too is when we're talking about lower revenue growth possibly moving forward, it's slower growth off of an elevated revenue number. So when revenues increased 17% last year, you might have very minimal growth, but revenues have already increased. So it does make it challenging for states. In one hand, the downturn, there's more, states, there's more understanding that spending needs to be cut. It's clear what needs to be done during a downturn. In times like this, it can be challenging to balance the competing needs and also be forward-looking, trying to anticipate what's going to happen with the economy and state revenue moving forward.
So, given these high levels of uncertainty, do you expect that states will be a little more cautious as they do budgeting, just because it's really impossible to know where things are going to go?
Yeah, I think we have seen that in budget proposals. We've seen a strong emphasis on using one-time funds, things like paying down debt, trying to short your pension, increasing your rainy day funds, more investments in capital, one-time investments in capital. So we've seen that quite a bit, and I think we'll continue to see that, trying to be cautious. We'll see some spending increases. Looking at taking the steps, we've also seen efforts toward streamlining government, trying to anticipate some of these future changes that will take place. There are so many things impacting states and the economy right now that are trying to be cautious, while at the same time responding to the needs of the citizens and states, and that has led to some increased spending demands, but also being forward-looking for the whatever may occur in the future.
So we talked a little bit about inflation. Obviously affects cost of goods, but one place where I imagine it's got to be significant for state and local governments is wages. Are you starting to see some significant wage effects, and is that going to affect spending plans for the future?
Yeah, we have seen that impact. I think, one thing tied into that is a really large issue for states right now is workforce and increase in wage that. And we have seen workforce challenges for states for both the private sector, trying to attract workers, identify where the needs are for different fields, but then also for state employees. It's been a tremendous challenge over the past year. So trying to attract state workers. We've seen some states very high vacancy level, public safety being one. States are having a very hard time attracting corrections employees, teachers. It's been well publicized, some of the shortages in that. Even in other departments of state government, there's been workforce. So, as we're seeing inflation, we have seen a number of governors propose salary increases, probably more so than we've seen in a number of years.
Mhm.
A lot of instances, these aren't 2 or 3% salary increase, 5% salary increases, 7% salary increase. So, on one hand, trying to keep up with the pace of inflation, but then also trying to attract workers, making sure that the private sector.
So one member of our audience asked another obvious question, which is the Fed is raising interest rates. That I assume is going to affect borrowing costs for state and local governments. Are you starting to see any effect of that yet?
A little. We don't have all the numbers yet to see how much of an impact. I think obviously one area that's being impacted and you're not going to see much of in the near future is refinancing. A number of states had refinanced for the past years. Right, so now the interest rate, it may impact some borrowing moving forward. Of course, debt is only one way that states are able to pay for capital. So states are using some one-time funds for it, one-time. Then, of course, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, some of those funds are being directed in. So, I think we're looking forward. We'll see a variety of means to fund infrastructure. We're going to solely use debt to be able to meet the infrastructure needs that are currently out there.
So we are the Tax Policy Center. So let me ask you a little bit about taxes. We saw a number of states cutting taxes in many different ways over the past couple of years. Let's break them down a little bit. So one of them is states cutting income taxes, and we've seen a couple of varieties of this. Some of enacting permanent income tax rate reductions, and some are enacting rate reductions contingent on future revenues or economic growth. Give us a sense of what states are doing kind of in that area.
Yeah, no, we've definitely seen a lot of talk and discussion about reducing personal. I would say that's been the biggest focus is tax cuts. And as you noted, there's quite a bit of variation in the type and scope of the tax cuts. A number of the tax cuts, personal income tax cuts, are phased in over a series of years. So a certain percentage in the first year, reductions in ongoing years. Some of those future tax cuts are based on different triggers. So you would need continued revenue growth or other indicators to allow for the future tax cuts. We also have seen with some of the personal income tax reductions, they've been scaled back a little bit since the initial proposals. There's some discussion completely eliminating personal income tax. We have not seen any state eliminate the personal income tax. Some states have personal income tax. Ones that currently have it, none have moved to completely eliminate that. We also saw a similar discussion after the Great Recession. States started where there was a governor, a number of legislators at that time that proposed eliminating personal income taxes. No states did it then either. I think you're likely to see continued movement reducing personal income tax. If the economy was to turn, some of those future paused. I'm not sure how much is rolling back some of the already occurred, but some of the future tax might not end up happening. And, we've also, I'm getting, but in addition to more the broad taxes, we've also seen more targeted tax cut proposals. You know, things like helping retirees, cutting grocery taxes, cutting car taxes, property taxes. And then the other area where we've seen a lot of talk is in tax rebates. A number of governors have proposed, and in many states have already occurred, providing rebates. So this idea of returning part of the surplus back to taxpayers has been another we're seeing in tax policy right now.
So those rebates, in a sense, are temporary. The idea is being a little more cautious rather than a permanent change in income taxes, or even a contingent change in income taxes. This is just a one-time only tax cut.
Correct. Yes, the vast majority. Some states have laws on the book when anytime revenues exceed projections, that the taxpayers, California, Colorado, and Oregon being. Yes, these ones that are being discussed right now are one time due to the current surplus for this fiscal year.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned grocery taxes. There was a lot of talk about it. What in the end has actually happened with grocery taxes? Are many states actually cutting them?
A handful, I believe Kansas this week, and I'd have to go back and double check, but I believe Kansas did end up reducing, or they might have ended up completely eliminating the grocery tax. I don't believe it was going to happen immediately. I think in 2023. I think Illinois was a state that was pausing some of the grocery taxes. There's some states eliminating it, some states pausing it. So, which is what we're seeing with a lot of these tax cut proposals is recognition of increased prices, consumers are facing the impact of them, and so it's a number of these tax cut proposals geared at individuals, rising price, returning part of the surplus, also helping.
So gas taxes, of course, were another big issue. Again, many states talked about it. In the end, how many states actually enacted gas tax holidays?
Yeah, we had a fair amount that enacted gas tax holidays. Some have already now come to an end. Right, they declined by and large yet. But that was a popular area where we saw a number of states take action, and it's an area where we're still seeing discussion of, but other states that haven't done. So I think that'll be an area where we'll continue to discuss. Of course, it can impact long-term transportation funding needs. Short-term is as impactful, but if you do pause gas tax for a long time, it can impact some of the revenues for transportation. At the same time, they're trying to increase on transportation infrastructure. So that is something that states need to keep in mind as they're looking at these gas tax policies.
And I guess in the longer term, as more and more people are going to electric vehicles and other alternative fuel vehicles, I guess states are thinking more and more about vehicle miles traveled taxes and actually structural changes in the gas tax.
Correct. Yeah, that's an area that we were seeing states start to examine before the downturn, and we're seeing it continue on now. How was the issue of people transitioning to electric vehicles? And of course, the pandemic itself has led to a change in consumer behavior. So some instances it might lead to people driving less. So even if they're not transitioning electric vehicles, if they're driving less, that can impact revenue moving forward. So on the tax side, they'll states are closely watching the impact of the pandemic and shift moving forward on impact streams. things like personal income taxes. And it's now become a question of, where does an employee actually work? If, you're in the DC area, you might have been working in DC, but living in Virginia or Maryland, it wasn't an issue when you're in the office almost every day. But if you're only in the office once a week, those type of where the employees actually working. I think localities are going to be dealing with, in some ways, more so than states on these questions. So cities are definitely be impacted by revenue, especially the commercial real estate market.
Right. It's an interesting question, this whole issue of people working remotely and who gets to tax them. Do you see a mechanism for states to work this out and local governments to work this out among themselves? Or is this something that's going to get sorted out in court in the end? Of course, there was the Massachusetts, New Hampshire case the Supreme Court didn't take. But do you think this is inevitably going to have to get sorted out in court?
I think it's too soon to tell. I think there's, this probably likely be various court cases, both within states dealing with, localities, challenging other localities, and then also across state borders. You would think that eventually they'll all become more consensus on how to deal with these issues, just like there has been reciprocity agreements in the past, with people living in one state and working in another. But it will be something that'll need to be sorted out moving forward, and be some difficult legal questions and tax policy debates.
Mm-hmm. And another sort of post-COVID question about sales taxes. So as you mentioned at the beginning, the sales tax base remains largely goods. And that, of course, turned out to be serendipitous during COVID and the recent recovery, when so much consumption was goods-based. But is that sustainable over the long run? Are states inevitably going to have to figure out ways to tax services?
Yeah, I do think you'll see states once again examine how to tax. That's another area where there was a movement in that before the downturn. If you looked at where people were spending their money, there was an increasing movement to spend on services, physical goods. So there was quite a bit of debate then and examination of how to taxing services. For the most part, when states look at tax services, it has not been well received by the various industries impacted. So most of those movements to tax services haven't occurred. There's been more implementation. I do think moving forward that states will continue to look at taxing services. It might not be all industries, it might be industries, but sales taxes being such a big part of state revenues, and some, predominantly relying on them. I think we'll see more of this taxing services moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are out of time. Brian Sigritz, thank you so much for taking time talking with us. It is an interesting, unlike the federal government, where there's almost no interesting tax policy happening, there's an awful lot going on in the states. So it's great to talk to you. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to our audience.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.